Hallo zusammen. Hier bin ich wieder mal.
Hello everyone, here I am once again speaking in German because today I am talking with Dr. Renate Dillmann, a German political scientist, media researcher and journalist who has been dealing with the topic of media power for many years. That's what we want to talk about today. Dear Ms. Dillmann, welcome.
Liebe Frau Dillmann, herzlich willkommen.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation, dear Mr. Lotta. I find this interesting. In a way, this is the first time I am speaking with Japan, and I am looking forward to our conversation.
Ja, ich wollte gerne mit Ihnen reden, denn Sie sind
Yes, I wanted to talk to you because you are friends with and know the good Mr. Patrick Barb, who also said that you have once again written a very interesting book about media and power. I would like to talk to you about that. And then in the second part today, also a bit about the coverage of China in Europe. You have an interesting introduction where you write about wording, framing, and narratives. Could you briefly explain to me what the difference between these three terms is for you and why we should pay attention to all three?
Und warum wir auf alle drei achten sollten?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. But before I begin, I'd like to make a brief preliminary remark, if that's allowed. So, in my media critical studies, my aim is to draw attention to certain elements of political reporting that keep recurring and which I consider problematic from the standpoint of information and, let's say, at least an attempt at objective reporting. And you just mentioned European, but my analysis really is limited to the leading German media.
Beschränkt sich dabei wirklich auf die deutschen Leitmedien. Ein allgemeineres Urteil kann ich mir da nicht anmaßen.
I can't presume to make a more general judgment, not even for the rest of the German-speaking world, such as Austria and Switzerland. However, viewers from other language regions can, of course, think along and consider whether and how these phenomena can be observed in their respective media. That's just a preliminary remark. Now I'll move on to the questions. Wording, what does that mean? It means that even in the naming, in the designation of a situation or a subject, there is often more involved than just mere information.
Mehr drin steckt als eine bloße Information. Beispiele. Ob die deutschen Journalisten etwas Krieg nennen.
Whether German journalists call something a war, as in the case of Ukraine, or whether they call it an operation or mission, as in the cases of Afghanistan or Yugoslavia, is not actually determined by the facts themselves, such as the military involved, the violence used, or similar factors, but rather by a more approving or disapproving attitude toward the event. And this attitude, by the way, usually corresponds to the general stance of German foreign policy. In the cases of Afghanistan and Yugoslavia, for example, they deliberately avoided calling it a war and instead used more downplaying terms like operation or mission. And accordingly, the German press has followed suit. To this day, by the way, the Bundeswehr website still uses the term operation.
Bis heute steht übrigens auf der Website der Bundeswehr Einsatz.
Deployment in Afghanistan, and so on.
You will find mission in Afghanistan ended on the Bundeswehr's website.
Exactly. And the same press is very eager to make sure that the war in Ukraine is always called the war of Russia against Ukraine. So they're very clear about naming what's going on, right? Yes.
Unbedingt, auch noch immer mit den
Absolutely, and still always with the specific additions like war of aggression in violation of international law, in order to really cast this war as massively unlawful, which in principle would also have applied to the operations in Afghanistan and Yugoslavia, which took place with German involvement. But back then, they didn't want to put it that way, didn't want to say it so explicitly, and instead justified and downplayed it as a mission. We're building girls' schools, we're drilling wells, that was the narrative there, or missions in the case of the Yugoslav war. We're coming to the aid of the threatened Kosovars. Next example.
Nächstes Beispiel. Ob man was Regierung oder Regime nennt.
Whether something is called a government or a regime, is also a matter of wording that does not, as one might assume, stem from whether the respective individuals were elected, which, by the way, is a political standard rooted in the Western understanding of representative democracy, but that's just an aside, but rather from political sympathy or antipathy toward another country. The rulers in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, for example, are never referred to as a regime by German journalists, whereas Russian President Putin or China's Xi Jinping are. The double standards, yes. The double standards, very true.
You still consider all of that to fall under the category of wording, not yet under framing.
Exactly. I would first describe that as wording. The term framing, on the other hand, actually refers to an entire perspective on an event. As the name suggests, it aims to set a frame through which journalists and media consumers adopt a shared perspective on an event. Let me give you an example. Syria, for instance, is currently being persistently covered in German news under the label liberation. Whether this actually reflects the feelings of some, or even all Syrians, or whether it mainly expresses the relief of the German media and the German government that the rather unpopular ruler Assad is finally gone, liberation, that's another question entirely. Let me give you another example, this time Afghanistan.
Dann nehme ich noch mal ein anderes Beispiel, nochmal Afghanistan. Damals hieß eine Schlagzeile aus dem Afghanistan-Krieg.
Back then, a headline from the Afghanistan war read, "Extremists attack the Bundeswehr." The framing here, the Bundeswehr, the German army, is, geographically speaking, 5,000 kilometers east of German territory, but the idea of the article is that it is rightfully there, and it is being attacked. Who is attacking it? Of course, not the Afghan people, who might have preferred that the German soldiers leave their land, but rather extremists. So these are forces outside of the Afghan people. And you can certainly imagine, if you have this notion that only extremists could object to the German army being in Afghanistan, that the German press was genuinely surprised by what happened in 2021 when the Western troops withdrew. So this definitely has consequences, the framing one chooses to present. Maybe one last example, because it comes up quite often. Reports on protests in countries that are friendly with Germany almost always focus on how the local government manages to deal with the demonstrators as smoothly and effortlessly as possible. The violence of the demonstrators is always emphasized, as in the case of the yellow vests in France. But when it comes to protests in countries that German foreign policy considers problematic, it's a completely different story. In Iran, Hong Kong, or Venezuela, the demands of the demonstrators are usually seen as entirely justified, often without further questioning. Instead, the violence of the police or the regime is highlighted. So that's the significance of framing.
And
this framing is incredibly important. I sometimes just wonder how it's possible that journalists can impose such obvious framings. And that brings me to the last example you mentioned. Georgia, recently, protests. And the German coverage, even in English, on Deutsche Welle, that's a German channel, DW in English, they said how peacefully the people were protesting and how violently the police were acting, while showing footage of these protesters firing rockets, that is, fireworks rockets, at the Parliament building. Just imagine if that had happened in Germany. The same media would have been shouting that anti-democratic forces were trying to storm the Bundestag. How does this double standard come about? Sorry, this takes us a bit away from the narratives, but can you explain this double standard?
Yes, by the way, what you said is a wonderful way to verify many reports. The technique of cross-checking. Just imagine what would happen if this were to occur here. Or what if an Afghan journalist were to report on something like this? How can this be explained? First of all, I would say at this point, journalists are citizens, after all. They view what is happening in the world almost automatically through a national lens and look at the world in exactly the way that, by and large, we already know, dividing the world into friends and enemies. We'll certainly get into this in more detail later, but for now that would be my general answer. And then it actually goes unnoticed that just a minute earlier, one argued and reported in a completely different way for another country. That's an interesting phenomenon, a kind of political schizophrenia.
A lack of recognizing one's own framing, so people don't see how their framing can be identified. And then we come to the third term, narrative. In what way is a narrative different from framing? I assume it gets broader and broader.
Exactly, you could actually label it the same way. A narrative is essentially the interpretation of an event or a larger context where it has succeeded in being anchored, so to speak, in the collective memory of a population so that it can later be easily recalled and used for one's own argumentation. So, we are currently seeing this very strongly in Germany with the narrative of Putin's unprovoked aggressive war of aggression in Ukraine. This narrative is, in a way, abstracted from everything that came before. The history, the long-standing conflicts between the two opponents, Russia and Ukraine, how NATO played a role, NATO's eastward expansion, and all of that. This has been successful. Over the past 3 years, it has become firmly established in Germany. And today, it can be called upon to justify why greater rearmament is necessary again, why massive rearmament is needed against an aggressive Putin, the reintroduction of conscription, and so on. So people can fall back on an interpretation that has taken root in the collective memory. That is a narrative.
And they are extremely valuable. Germany has helped protect Afghanistan, liberate Libya, and prevent further genocides in Yugoslavia. These are the narratives, right? Exactly, yes. How precarious do you currently see the situation, or the state of the German media landscape in terms of highly biased is the term one could use here? So, always trying not to inform a readership, but to steer a readership and audience. On a scale from 1 to 10, where are we in terms of controlled media reporting?
That's a difficult question. Quantifying it, I really don't know. Maybe it's 7, or I don't know.
I would have said the same. I would agree with that as well.
Yes, it's intense. So, the narrowing of the so-called spectrum of opinion, as it's often called, has actually been very noticeable in Germany at the latest since the Ukraine war, but really even before that. The visible consequence is that people who were previously welcome participants in public discourse, like Ulrike Guerreau, whom you've also interviewed, or Patrick Bob, or former generals like Harold Kuyat and Eric Vade, who were highly respected talk show guests, or Middle East expert Michael Luders, or former Russia correspondent Gabriele Krone-Schmalz, were, so to speak, excluded from German TV talk shows almost overnight. They've had trouble finding venues for public lectures. They were no longer able to publish in all media at all. In some cases, there were dismissals at universities and similar actions. So these are really not insignificant measures. And they are also meant to have a deterrent effect on other, let's say, dissidents who do not want to go along with the publicly prescribed line in terms of interpretation. I don't know, maybe we should give the listeners a brief overview of the German media landscape. That might be quite interesting, and not everyone is familiar with it. So in Germany, to summarize roughly, there are, first of all, the newspaper publishers. These are the major national daily newspapers. Frankfurter Allgemeine, Süddeutsche, Die Welt, Handelsblatt, Bild-Zeitung, and then there are the regional ones.
privatwirtschaftliche Unternehmen. Und die wollen
These publishing houses are private companies, and on the one hand, they simply want to make money with the business of information. That's the first point. The second point is, because they operate in the information sector as companies, they are recognized as so-called tendency businesses. This means it is officially recognized that the owners, the economic owners of a publication, determine its political direction and can, of course, exert political influence, such as being economically liberal, pro-NATO, and so on. And the economic competition between publishers naturally makes concentration necessary. By now, only a few large publishing houses remain in Germany.
Wenige große Verlage in Deutschland übrig geblieben. Das führt zu Rationalisierungen auch in Redaktionen und für Journalisten.
This leads to rationalizations, including in editorial offices. And for journalists, this means there is less time for research. As a result, there is a tendency to rely on things like press releases from companies or politicians or on news agency reports. And this tends to lead to, this is an important point, a shift from reporting about politics and business to reporting for politics and business. A small but significant difference. And the increasingly frequent precarious employment contracts, there are fewer and fewer permanently employed journalists, of course also make people more susceptible to pressure from editorial management or even higher levels. That's how it is.
Yes, Mr. Barb has repeatedly emphasized in conversations that even without giving editorial guidelines to these freelancers, they eventually realize which articles will be bought and which won't. And then you just sell what can be sold. And that's how you achieve uniformity.
So ist es, genau.
That's right, exactly. Now, in Germany, there is also, this is perhaps a bit unique, it doesn't exist everywhere, public broadcasting. By the way, that also includes television. Back then it was just called that because there was no television yet. So that includes the first German television, ARD with its regional stations, and the second German television, ZDF. This is actually an institution that has existed since after World War II, established by the Allies as, this is interesting, a state-independent institution modeled after the British BBC. The idea was to prevent Germany from ever again having something like a government propaganda instrument like the Reichs used to be.
And
that's why public broadcasting is not funded by taxes. And of course, it's not privately capitalist either. Instead, it's financed by mandatory fees from private households. So everyone who has radio and television has to pay for it. Financially, it's not under as much pressure as privately owned media. And now a key substantive difference. Unlike private publishers, where the political preferences of the owners are allowed to come into play, public broadcasting is actually obligated to be objective. It is supposed to represent the political spectrum of opinions in Germany in a balanced way. But in reality, as we've just discussed, this requirement looks a bit different, because mechanisms like wording, framing, and narratives naturally come into play there as well.
Natürlich auch da überall zum Zug kommen. And
the fact that in the talk shows that are quite popular in Germany, the same voices from economics, politics, and culture are always invited, and let's say genuinely dissenting opinions have no place. So I actually find it quite interesting to explicitly point this out for viewers from countries who might have illusions about a, let's say, free democratic public sphere with state-guaranteed freedom of opinion and press. In Germany, it's just as controlled and narrow-minded as it probably is in their countries, too. And yes, alongside that, there are, of course, some smaller left-wing and right-wing daily newspapers, a few online platforms, podcasts, and the like, which offer alternative news, analyses, and also a bit of media criticism. Some of them are actually quite successful.
It's not that there aren't alternative media and alternative viewpoints. A problem we definitely have, and this isn't just the case in Germany, but also in Austria and Switzerland, is that the major media outlets, especially the big newspapers and public broadcasters, don't even cover many of these discussions, or they dismiss them from the outset. And there's something here I'd like to ask you about, because there's an interesting word in German.
Es gibt ein interessantes Wort auf Deutsch. Die Zuschauer, die dieses Gespräch nachher in Fremdsprachen hören werden.
The viewers who will later listen to this conversation in foreign languages, it's a bit difficult to convey this properly now, but in German, this word is Deutungshoheit. So it means the right or the sovereignty of the narrator to be able to offer an interpretation and then to be able to assert it. I've looked into this, and it's quite traceable. It only emerged around the 1990s. It didn't appear before that in books written in German. The word Deutungshoheit seems to be somehow connected to our era. Was it better in the past? Was it better in the 60s, 70s and 80s in West Germany?
BRD besser.
Ja, also man kann natürlich feststellen, dass die
Well, you can certainly observe that, well, first of all, it used to be much worse, by no means better. The Adenauer era and the beginning of the Cold War and so on were, of course, a similarly regimented public sphere in Germany, as I would classify it again now. The student movement of '68, with its criticism, again, this is not a real democracy in Germany at all. There is basically still fascism here. And its criticism of the Vietnam War and the Federal Republic's accession to NATO brought certain issues into the German public sphere for the first time and demanded to have a voice on them. And it was so broadly based that at some point it really could no longer be suppressed.
auch tatsächlich nicht mehr zu unterdrücken war. Also der Studentenbewegung kommt durchaus.
The student movement certainly deserves credit for breaking up this rigid discourse in West Germany in the first place. And something like pluralism, which people actually started to value a bit from then on, really gained momentum with the first social democratic government during the Brandt era and so on. Yes, I would say there was actually a state-sanctioned pluralism. There was an officially permitted discussion of pros and cons, of daring more democracy and so on, which incidentally was accompanied by professional bands to make sure everyone knew exactly where the boundaries were. So it wasn't supposed to go too far.
Also das darf jetzt nicht zu weit werden. Ja, und Sie haben jetzt gesagt 1990er Jahre.
Yes, and you just said that the issue of interpretive authority emerged in the 1990s. Interestingly, that happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union after the end of the Cold War, with the awareness that the West had clearly won, and that its form of capitalism and democracy was now, so to speak, on the definitively justified path for the world. At that point, there was no longer any need to acknowledge dissenting or critical opinions. That was basically the end of discourse. They felt justified, including when it came to interpretive authority. In Germany, I would say the first real break in this regard came in 2013-14 with the Euromaidan.
2013-14 mit dem Euromaidan. Damals gab es gegen die
Back then, there were such massive protests from the public against the truly one-sided and very anti-Russian reporting that for the first time there were also reprimands from the Program Advisory Board, which is an internal oversight body within public broadcasters, regarding the coverage. That had never happened before. It was basically unprecedented, and that led up to the term lying press. At that point, the public broadcasters really faced a certain problem, that they could lose their authority to interpret events. If they are viewed that way by relatively large segments of the population, if people no longer believe them, then their news essentially loses credibility. And then, of course, they can no longer convey the desired narratives to the public in the way they intend. That was a serious problem.
Das war ein ernsthaftes Problem.
Aber in den letzten Jahren haben wir ja eher gesehen, wie dieses Phänomen wieder zugenommen.
But in recent years, we've actually seen this phenomenon increase again. The push for a prescribed framing. And it doesn't even have to be about the war in Ukraine. I'm also thinking of the entire Corona period, how massively the media in Germany, but also in Switzerland and Austria, insisted that a certain interpretation of what was happening at the time had to be believed. And anyone who didn't do that was considered part of the problem. How do you see this between 2014 and now? Has this counter-movement become stronger, or has the crackdown become stronger again?
Crackdown stärker geworden.
Also die Medien haben das wirklich als ein
Well, the media really saw this as a problem but reacted in a peculiar way, namely by being offended. So it wasn't that it prompted them to engage in self-critical reflection or anything like that. No, that period actually led to some ARD and ZDF journalists leaving at the time. People who, in a sense, took the journalistic ethos seriously, like Patrick Barth, for example, and then Klingenkammer, Bräutigam, and so on, Reinhard Lauterbach, who is now at Junge Welt. These are all cases of people who said, I can no longer go along with this one-sidedness and untruth. But those who stayed.
Also, die aber geblieben sind, die sind der Auffassung, dass das eigentlich eine
They believe that this is actually an unfair criticism of them and that they deserve the public's trust. And they try to restore that trust with things like fact checks, proving that falsehoods are being spread elsewhere on social media and that only they can be trusted, and so on. And since you mentioned COVID, the government initially had the problem that its planned COVID measures really depended on the cooperation of the public. To accept such restrictions, you were allowed to work, but private contacts were now considered harmful, which was in itself completely contradictory. Masks were said to be useless, but then masks were useful from the moment they became available.
Ab dem Moment, wo sie vorhanden waren, jetzt müssen sich alle impfen lassen, weil die Impfstoffe sind.
Now everyone has to get vaccinated because the vaccines are available and we have no other strategy. So this kind of measure needs to be communicated to the public because it can only work if everyone really supports it. This led to such massive agitation by the media. In a way, it was necessary, and they did it so that everyone noticed. I think that was the point. A self-contradictory policy is now being conveyed to the public through 24/7 talk. And anyone who even dares to ask a question is immediately considered a denier or something like that. That was truly a totalitarian approach.
Das war ein wirklich totalitäres Verfahren.
Nehmen Sie das auch als ein Teil der
Do you also see this as part, not of the strategy, but of the logic of this process? Because I notice, as a pattern, that this is also evident now in the Ukraine war, or partly with Israel and Palestine, that this policy being pursued often contains content-related contradictions, points that contradict themselves, which are then also reflected in the media. With COVID, it was especially extreme, where it was officially stated by politicians, in English, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And that was about masks, but later also about vaccination. So everyone has to get vaccinated so that everyone is protected from everyone else. If only some people get vaccinated, then they are still at risk. So society is still at risk.
Immer in Gefahr. Also die Gesellschaft ist noch immer in Gefahr. Das ist ja ein Widerspruch in sich, denn die Impfung.
That's a contradiction in itself, because the vaccination is supposed to protect the vaccinated person. So it shouldn't matter anymore what others do. And the media kept rehashing this point. And in the Ukraine war, we now see how it's simultaneously claimed, or for a long time, for 2.5 years it was claimed, Russia is the greatest threat to Europe since World War II. But Russia is also super weak. So Russia can't do anything. Russia is losing. We are winning. We've almost got it. And both of these things are supposed to be believed, but you can't believe both at the same time. And if you start to question either of these beliefs, you're sidelined. Is that part of the logic of how these narratives work?
Wie diese Narrative funktionieren?
Ja, unbedingt.
Yes, absolutely. The attempt is really to create an irrefutability of the positions being presented. And, in the case of the Ukraine war, that now means, first, Putin is in the wrong, and second, he is also militarily unsuccessful. These are two standards that are both being put forward out of the need to absolutely justify one's own position and to promise the public that we will be successful. The fact that these don't fit together is, so to speak, a logical subproblem that is elegantly glossed over. And to this day, they actually manage to maintain both. And yes, that is basically interesting. And of course, it's one of those points where you can really recommend to the audience, please folks, just turn on your logical thinking.
Bitte Leute, schaltet einfach euer logisches Denken ein. Manchmal hat man ja bei der, sagen wir mal,
Sometimes when reviewing media statements, you have the problem. I lack background knowledge. I can't really judge this because I know so little about the country, the history, various geostrategic interests, and so on. But the things you just mentioned are really cases where logical thinking helps, where you can say, wait a minute, something's not right here. If I'm being told both things, that's simply impossible. So the whole narrative, the whole intention, can't be right either. That's when I need to become alert and investigate further. That's a very important point. And if the audience were to do that, we would already be a big, big step ahead.
Ja, aber es ist perfide, also diese Spielchen.
Yes, but it's insidious, these games, and also with people's capacity to understand and think. I find it quite insidious that there's this expectation that certain things should just be believed now, even if they're contradictory. Which brings me to another point. How do the media manage to make a significant number of people no longer want to compare like with like, or are no longer able to equate things that are the same?
Vergleichen mag, gleichstellen kann. Mir fällt hier ein, also wie zum Beispiel immer wieder Israels Gewalt.
What comes to mind here is how, for example, Israel's use of force is repeatedly portrayed as legitimate and, all in all, acceptable, while any kind of violence from the Palestinian side, not just from Hamas but previously from other groups as well, is always radically depicted as terrorism and as a crime against humanity, and that many people are also denied the opportunity to say, wait a minute, both sides are using violence. Why can't we compare that? Because in Germany, even just saying that is practically criminalized at the moment. If you say, no, Hamas has a right to self-defense, anyone who says that can get into trouble in Germany today.
Wer das sagt, der kann heute in Deutschland Schwierigkeiten kriegen.
Das stimmt. Also das ist auch wirklich festzuhalten.
That's true. So it's really important to note that the pressure to enforce this interpretive authority is truly immense. But still, you can't really say that this is solely the achievement of the media. We really have to look at the audience as well. I mean, it may be that the media use these manipulative methods, right? That they act exactly as you described. And of course, the media want to influence the audience in the sense of this controlled reporting, in the sense of interpreting the world through a German lens. But still, it's important to point out, for this to work, the audience also has to be willing to believe it in some way. Even the boldest headline or the most emotionally moving image or something like that has to be picked up by the mind of a media consumer, thought through and somehow judged to be trustworthy, plausible, or something like that.
Oder sowas befunden werden. Anders funktioniert die Kommunikation eines Senders, das ist ja in dem Fall
Communication between a sender, in this case the media, and a receiver, meaning the audience, doesn't work any other way. And you can already see, placing trust, believing the media, is something different from the willingness to question the daily news and to challenge it with simple thought processes, like the ones we just discussed. You were absolutely right when you said, if in minute 1 someone is considered a terrorist because of their violent means, and in minute 2 the same means multiplied many times over are seen as a legitimate reaction in the case of Israel, or as justified opposition in the case of Syria, then, logically speaking, that's just nonsense.
Logisch betrachtet Gaga. So, und wenn aber jetzt so ein Mitdenken und Bezweifeln von
And if this kind of critical thinking and questioning from the audience doesn't take place, then it must be noted that the audience itself isn't simply interested in information or truthful news, but rather that the audience brings with it a fundamental willingness to listen to news about the world from a national perspective, and therefore, in a sense, voluntarily forgoes its admittedly limited opportunities for verification and criticism. This is also evident in the fact that there are media-critical platforms or alternative reporting. However, despite all the media criticism, these remain outsiders in the national discourse. Yet anyone dissatisfied with the reporting of mainstream media could find them.
Berichterstattung der Leitmedien könnte die finden.
Haben Sie denn das Gefühl, dass die deutsche Zuhörerschaft...
Do you have the feeling that the German audience, the German public, is simply not critical enough of the information that is fed to them? So is it a national problem in Germany that there is too little criticism?
Es ist ein nationales Problem in Deutschland, dass Kritik zu wenig geübt wird.
Sicher, auf jeden Fall. Aber ich glaube nicht, dass es
Sure, absolutely. But I don't think it's limited entirely to Germany, so to speak. These are certainly considerations that actually apply to other countries and other populations as well. So that's really an interesting phenomenon, the attitude of media consumers. I actually think when you think of Chomsky's manufacturing consent, that this is a point that was missing there. That's why I want to draw attention to my book again. I believe I've really found and analyzed an important point here, one that was still needed, so to speak, for critical media theories, ideas about manipulation, and so on.
Yes, and the book again for everyone. It's called Media and Power, if I remember correctly.
Of course, I'm happy to hold it up again.
Medienmacht Meinung auf dem Weg in die Kriegstüchtigkeit, und ich entschuldige mich, normalerweise stelle ich die Bücher am Anfang immer vor, aber ich habe das jetzt aus irgendeinem Grund weggelassen.
Media shapes opinion on the path to war readiness. You've spent many years on this, including in your research. How is China currently portrayed in the German media?
Im Moment eigentlich vorwiegend negativ.
At the moment, actually predominantly negative. If you look back a bit, you could say it wasn't always like this. There was definitely an ambivalent portrayal. For quite some time, China's achievements were also acknowledged. Let's say its tremendous development, its technological accomplishments, the PISA performance of Chinese students, and such things were reported on with a sense of admiration. And that's actually interesting in itself, because you can ask what it was that impressed the journalists and readers. Well, to put it quite simply, that was the success of China in areas, namely money and power, that are usually attributed to Germany itself. And from that perspective, it was interesting that this country in Asia suddenly succeeded in these areas. But today, the reporting is clearly under the theme, China poses a threat. I've put together a short list of publications, all from the last 20 years. China, A World Power Returns, The China Challenge, The Asian Century, Global Rivals, China's Uncanny Rise and the Powerlessness of the West. The China Shock, Dragon Dance, China's Rise to World Power and What It Means for Us, China's Reach for the West, Silent Conquest, End of the China Illusion, The Dirty Silk Road. So you really hear it. This is an endless series with the same recurring question, namely, what does this new China mean for Germany and its success on the world market and in competition between states? And it's taken for granted here, meaning that this is the question to ask when discussing a country. So that's already interesting.
No, sorry, please go ahead.
So it's particularly interesting for this reason. I myself come from the Third World movement of the 1970s, and back then there was this widely promoted idea of the developing countries. The idea was that these states, which had just been released from colonialism, should now develop with the support of the Western nations and then catch up economically and politically. And now we have a country that has basically managed to accomplish exactly this program. It is actually the only country that has caught up economically and politically, now meets the established Western nations on equal footing. And you can see how this country is being treated now. Not at all with enthusiasm, with applause, with a yes, bravo, you are the pioneering model for the countries of the global south or anything like that. That's interesting. Of course, the Western countries did not imagine this, they did not foresee it, and they also did not want it to happen when, starting in the 1980s, they encouraged their capital to invest in China. That's the reason.
China is, so to speak, the biggest and most resounding slap in the face to the idea, Francis Fukuyama's idea, the liberal notion of the end of history. He never meant that history would literally stop. What he meant was that it was now clear which social model works and which ones don't. And we in the West, Europe, America, Japan, the capitalist countries, liberal democracies, had proven that we were capable of thriving. The others, especially the communist system, were unviable, and so we would all now move into this liberal future. And China has now exposed that as the biggest lie. Is that also an element of what is currently being perceived as a threat in Europe, and especially in Germany? That we no longer have the only functioning and possible system, but that there are now alternative models? Or am I already going too far in my interpretation?
Gehe ich da schon zu weit in meiner Deutung?
Well, China is of course no longer really perceived as a socialist or communist country in that sense. By the way, I wouldn't say that either. But it is perceived as an authoritarian state. And the claim is that as this authoritarian state, and now a globally successful economy, it is a systemic competitor. There is definitely the notion that China actually wants to impose its way of statecraft, of governing on the rest of the world, and is therefore a threat to our liberal democracies.
I find that very interesting, because China always says that the basic principle is non-intervention in other states. So the only countries that repeatedly try to impose their own model on others, and even demand change under threat of force, are Europe and America. The projection is quite fascinating, isn't it?
Yes, I sometimes think that too. Obviously, people can't help but view other countries through the lens of how they themselves deal with the rest of the world. And they automatically assume that this must be the other side's interest and strategy. Meanwhile, China has stated 1,000 times that its system of government is its own, tailored to its needs, and that it has absolutely no interest in or makes any effort to impose it on anyone else in the world. This is actually in contrast to liberal Western democracy, which here in the West is considered the only possible way to govern, is more or less equated with international law and human rights, and therefore everyone is expected to adhere to it. And when something is different about them, it's described as a deficit, as a deviation from what is considered valid. Yes, and I think what we're discussing here is certainly not just an academic subtlety. The accusations made against the Chinese, like you don't have parties, you don't have party competition, you don't have a freely elected parliament, and so on, these are not just academic subtleties. This is really the banner under which the coming world war is supposed to be fought. That's how the US has announced it. And here in Europe, in German public discourse, people are really going along with it.
That brings me to the question of creating enemy images. In English, this discourse is also called the China threat, meaning the danger posed by China, which is largely adopted in Europe as well. Although for Europe and Germany it makes even less sense, because China is really far away. I can somewhat understand America, since they see China on the other side of the Pacific. But for Germany, you really have to look hard to find a way in which China affects German interests, other than through trade, which always involves reciprocity. But this creation of enemy images that is taking place, there is research on this as well, for example by Dr. Jonas Togel, who wrote a book on NATO's cognitive warfare, a very interesting book. NATO officially says, yes, cognitive warfare is something we do, both externally meaning against other populations, but also internally, because we also have to influence our own population. There, it is marketed under the term resilience, meaning protecting our own population from evil and harmful narratives from abroad, but it is clearly handled as cognitive warfare. In connection with China, do you see such official or semi-official efforts to deliberately foster an enemy image in Germany as well?
Ein Feindbild in Deutschland zu schüren.
Ja, also eigentlich hätte ich jetzt geantwortet.
Well, actually, I would have answered, German journalists don't really need instructions from above or from NATO or anything like that. They already do it out of their own national interest. And you can see, by the way, you said China is incredibly far away, but you can clearly see that German interests are global, quite obviously. Germany definitely sees itself as an economic and political power that is affected by everything that happens on this planet. That's how far-reaching its definitions of interest are. There are really campaign-like waves of accusations against China, which on the one hand concern its expansive economy. Right now, electric cars are flooding European markets, that's one topic. And on the other hand, its political repression. It uses state violence against, let's say, the Hong Kong students, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and so on.
Es agiert neokolonial im globalen Süden.
It acts in a neocolonial way in the global south and so on. These are really campaign-like projects, waves that sweep through Germany. And of course I agree with you. Something like the claim that a genocide is being committed against the Uyghurs actually did come from the top levels of the US government and was really anchored, so to speak, in all areas of Western media and thus adopted and supported. So you can really see that happening. Otherwise, I would say that journalists, firstly, have their own interests, and secondly, they are creative enough to create the corresponding enemy images themselves. That's what selective reporting is. We downplay the positive and exaggerate the negative.
Das Positive machen wir ganz klein und das Negative ganz groß. Die doppelten Standards, wenn wir was tun, ist es was anderes als wenn
The double standards, when we do something, it's different than when China does it. Or also resentful interpretations. If there is corruption, police violence, or censorship over there, then it's seen as systemic. If something like that happens here, then it's considered an exception, a deviation from what is actually valid, and so on. So they are quite professional in handling all these aspects and do so out of their own self-interest. But of course, there is also this NATO Disinformation Law, and anyone who writes something different regarding the main desired narratives is no longer seen as someone spreading information, but as a disinformer. All of this has already been established by now.
Inzwischen alles schon festgelegt.
Could you clarify that briefly? I wasn't aware of it. Is there a law on disinformation in Germany, or is there a regulation that comes from NATO?
Kam ursprünglich aus der NATO und wurde
We originally came from NATO, and this actually came up when it was about establishing this interpretation of the Navalny events in the German or European media. So it originated from NATO, but was then really adopted by the EU and has now taken on the character of a law. There is the accusation of disinformation, and in Germany now also the accusation of delegitimizing the German state. So, in this sense, criticism or dissenting opinions in nationally relevant narratives can actually be sanctioned in this way.
Kann tatsächlich in dem Sinn geahndet werden.
Delegitimization of the state. How long has this been part of the German criminal code?
Ich weiß gar nicht, ob es schon Bestandteil des Strafgesetzbuches ist.
I'm not even sure if it's already part of the criminal code. It was brought up by the last Minister of the Interior, Nancy Faeser. I'd have to check myself how it's anchored in law.
Wie das gesetzlich verankert ist.
Ja. Aber wir stellen im Moment also abschließend auch fest.
But we are also currently concluding that Germany is moving toward creating further regulations to categorize information flows and to definitively block unwanted information flows. That's already the case right now, isn't it?
Definitiv, also zu unterbinden. Das ist schon so im Moment, oder?
Unbedingt. Also das ist tatsächlich ein
Absolutely. So this is actually a rather curated information environment, to put it euphemistically. And of course that leads to the population in Germany really no longer being properly informed about the state of affairs in the world, about conflicts, wars, negotiations, and so on. You can definitely say that.
To me, that's highly concerning. Guided thinking, surely it can't be true that we're slipping back into that.
Oder weder die deutschen Medien noch die deutsche Regierung sehen da auch nur den allergeringsten Widerspruch dazu, dass man...
By the way, neither the German media nor the German government see even the slightest contradiction in holding the banner of freedom of speech and press very, very high when it comes to countries they consider problematic. China, Russia, Iran, and so on, North Korea. For them, there's absolutely no contradiction. And it's also interesting that the German population tends to think similarly. So, even from the general public, there's no outcry when all of this is now being enforced.
Wenn all das jetzt durchgesetzt wird.
The only way I can explain this is that a significant portion of the population, not just in Germany, but across Europe in general, wants to be protected from information they don't want to hear. Dr. Dillmann, that was extremely interesting. For people who want to find your books and your writings, where should they go online?
Just go to my website, renatedillmann.de.
Okay, I'll include that in the video description. Everyone, please take a look at Ms. Dillmann's books. Dr. Renate Dillmann, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for the invitation. I thought it was a very interesting conversation. Thank you.